Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to all of you in Budapest. We are very honored that you have accepted our invitation, and I would like to congratulate the Equilibrium Institute and to express my gratitude to Tamás and Réka for this fantastic event. We have been waiting for so long for such an important security event in Hungary. Ladies and gentlemen, a spectre is haunting Europe again. This time, the spectre is not communism, like Karl Marx envisaged. What we fear today is when the no longer communist Russians will move against Europe. Will they move at all? And if so, in 5 years, in 2 years, tomorrow? Because even though they are also unprepared for a war after the invasion of Ukraine, they want to take advantage of the fact that Europe seems also unprepared, and they might not want to wait until Europe is prepared. As a politician, I don't have to ponder the answers to these questions. That's the job of military experts and state secretary from the Minister of Defense. They do not do this publicly necessarily, but politicians should take into account that these many questions, or rather the uncertainty surrounding them, are in the air. And this uncertainty is probably the main characteristics of the current security situation in Europe. In this situation, from a political perspective, what we should see in Washington's 5%. It is not just a number and a slash with two circles on either side, but what lies behind it, what this number 5% expresses. That is the question. It would be a mistake, at the very least, to set as a political goal the mere demonstration that within 1, 2, or 5 years our defense spending will statistically exceed the 5% of Hungary's gross national product. This would mean that we just have to spend the money, but it doesn't really matter on what. Just take our own household. Even a large sum of money can be spent both well and really badly. Politically, the meaning of the 5% should be interpreted primarily as Europe becoming capable of defending itself, preferably not at the cost of such sacrifices as Ukraine is now having to pay for its own defense. Each of the allies must be able to contribute with indispensable capabilities to the defense of Europe. Defending Europe should not depend on the goodwill of others. The common defense, namely using our own capability, must become our well-understood interest and value if we needed to use it. The 5% means that Hungary and all allies will have to build up such a force in coordination with the allies, and it will cost roughly 5% of our GDP to achieve and maintain it. Money must therefore be assigned to the goal, but the goal is not money, but to become indispensable and efficient. The goal is the ability to defend the country and to make indispensable the Hungarian contribution to the defense of Europe and the alliance. I believe that this is what the political sphere should expect from the military profession, and this is what it should communicate to the society. I believe that Europe needs 5%, not because President Trump expects it, but because the nations need it to be safe, because that is what the Hungarian and the European peoples expect. As for indispensability, it is worth realizing that it is a moving target. What makes the Hungarian armed forces indispensable today may not be enough to make them indispensable tomorrow. At least that is the case because the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, Foreign Minister Wadepool, I would like to welcome also our German Deputy Assistant Secretary General for this very important German statement. They have just announced last week their intention to make the German army the strongest in Europe in terms of conventional warfare. The Poles announced the same thing not long before about the Polish army. I would like to welcome our Polish guests. The French, on the other hand, live on the fact that they have the most capable army in Europe at the moment, and they certainly do not want to lose that leadership. So there are a couple of candidates for the top position. Our humble Hungarian ambition should be to ensure our indispensable place in the European arms race in the midst of a fierce competition among allies. The arms race will make it increasingly difficult and increasingly expensive to be indispensable. And when we call for a step forward or even a step up in defense force development, we do not mean downgrading of the force development achievements until now. The development that has taken place in the Hungarian defense forces in recent years is of a historic scale, as we could listen to the State Secretary's speech. In a few years' time, we have transformed a country that was previously practically disarmed by communist and left liberal governments into a properly armed country. It's a kind of magic. It was almost a mission impossible, yet we accomplished it. This is an essential success for both the Hungarian political and the military sphere. I do not need to praise the merits of the Prime Minister or the Minister of Defense. The point is that Hungary currently has nothing to be ashamed of in NATO in terms of force development. The task now, however, is to ensure that we do not have to be ashamed in this area tomorrow either, because shame will not only be a prestige problem in the future for Hungary, but also a serious security problem. But this cannot happen. Hungary will adapt to changing circumstances, and to do so, we need to find the money to fulfill the substantial increase. Strong members form a strong alliance. However, if we want a strong Hungary and a strong NATO, it is not enough to think in terms of weapons, that is about the military capabilities that are indispensable for the alliance. We must make our allies interested in contributing to our defense, not only militarily. Another important dimension is that one that Trump's policy made most clearly evident in relation to Ukraine. I would draw your attention very much to this. This was the economic treaty concluded with the country at war, the so-called Mineral Resources Treaty. Until such a treaty was signed, the Americans, with some exaggeration, sorry for that, one might say, bargained with the Russians over Ukraine as if they had little stake in Ukraine's long-term security. Since the economic treaty was concluded, there has been, in my opinion, a change of tone. Ukraine is now essentially seen as their own, and that is something that the aggressor of Ukraine now must also take into account. I do not think that the Ukrainians are disadvantageously affected by this treaty, which the Americans forced upon them, as it might seem at first glance. Syria, for example, recently announced that it would like the same treaty with America, exactly like Ukraine. The Democratic Republic of Congo, ladies and gentlemen, is also pushing for this. So there are countries in the world for whom the American-Ukrainian treaty is a specific model. But it doesn't have to be a model for us in the European Union. We should learn a different lesson from the US-Ukraine treaty. The reason is that we are not in the same vulnerable position as Ukraine, Syria, and Congo. Each of these is either at actual war, in the case of Syria, seriously threatened by the renewal of a civil war that has recently ended. By the grace of God, we are not there yet, and we must work to ensure that we never find ourselves in such a situation in the European Union. But the lessons that we Hungarians and Europeans in general must learn from the security policy context of the US-Ukraine economic treaty is that, in Trump's interpretation, the security guarantee is based on common economic interests. If you want to be sure that America will do its part to protect you, then make America interested in yourselves. Therefore, if we assume that tomorrow the Russians will attack Europe, then we must conclude an economic agreement with America today. If the Russians attack in 2 years, then we must conclude such an agreement within a year or so. Not a Ukrainian type of agreement, because, as I said, we are not in the situation of the Ukraine. We should rather conclude something like the British have concluded just the other day, tailored to our own needs and possibilities, of course. The essence of the British deal is a major step forward in the integration of the British economy, and in particular, the defense industry with the US. This is what Hungary should strive for. At the same time, we must also strive to ensure that Europe, the European Union, also strives for this. Let us create a common US-Hungarian, US-European economic interest that encourages America to operate the military alliance at full intensity. In a sense, I am banging open gates when I say that Hungary was one of the first countries to take concrete steps in this direction. For example, at the same time as the Trump administration came into office, we created a special commissioner to promote the Hungarian-American investment and business partnership. In addition, this commissioner is the CEO of the Hungarian Development Bank, so we also put financial resources behind this effort. However, it is important to clearly see and make it clear that strengthening the Hungarian-American economic partnership is not just one of our many economic goals, but as a key priority. This is both our economic and security interest. We approach the negotiations with America in this spirit. We should not wait for American offer, and certainly not for dictates, because we are one of the most authentic allies of the Trump administration. They will not use dictates against us. We must figure out what we want from the Hungarian-American economic relations and what we can bring to it as our own share. And if we have our own vision, our own strategy of cooperation, then the economic partnership is that makes our allies interested in defending us. The same is true at European level. In fact, it is not a new idea. The idea of economic partnership between NATO allies was already in the Washington Treaty, in Article 3 of the original treaty. This is now has started to take shape in the form of the US-British treaty, which is likely to be followed by other treaties, which is my conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, we need an economic alliance at the Hungarian-American, European-American level that makes the 5% GDP defense expenditure affordable, economically viable, and sustainable. This should be important for both parties, for it is not in America's interest that defense spending should overwhelm its European allies, leading to an economic decline that makes the Europeans' 5% less relevant. Since America is our ally, it has a vested interest also in our economic success. Joint Hungarian, European, American future planning must be based on this very principle. Wake up or break up. The Hungarian conviction is that there is no way to break up, but it is high time to wake up. We must develop together with our allies. We must plan together. We must build a future together. This must be Hungary's NATO policy in the coming years, and then we will continue to live in security and prosperity, and this is, in my opinion, the real stake of the Hague Summit. Thank you very much for your attention.